Hey everybody, I'm Joe, and around here we like to talk about monsters. So when you have a villain, this can be a monster out of the monster manual or monsters of the multiverse, or it can be a villain you create as a character, such as the same way you would create a player character. We can give these villains really any ability that we feel like. We can homebrew them, we can create them, we can steal them from other aspects of the game, and it's all allowed as the DM, and we have that freedom. But when I give an ability to a villain, I like for it to be grounded and reasonable when my players hear about it and they experience it. So of course it is reasonable if it's a spell out of the player's handbook that the players could take. It's reasonable if it's an ability that they've seen and heard elsewhere. And I think it'd be particularly reasonable if it's a feat that players would be able to take. So today we're taking a look at one particular feat that is well loved for player characters. And we're going to take a look at what happens if we give it to your bad guy. Let's go. So the Mounted Combatant feat is a wonderful feat, and it is well loved, especially by melee characters in the game, most especially paladins, because they have Fine Steed and Fine Greater Steed as spells. And it has a lot of really nice components to it. There are three specifically. Let's take a look at them in case you're not familiar with the feat. The first one, and this is what most people are here for, states that a rider with the Mounted Combatant feat has blanket advantage on melee attack rolls against any creature that is smaller than the mount. So most of the time you see a paladin or a fighter with a warhorse, which is a large-sized creature, and that gives them blanket advantage on medium, small, and tiny-sized creatures, which is amazing. There are two more components to the feat, and these are there to make the mount basically more durable. The second one states that if something would target, so not saving throws, would target the mount, the rider can force that to target the rider instead, which of course makes the mount more durable since the mount is almost certainly going to have a lower hit point and armor class than the rider. And the third aspect of Mounted Combatant stipulates that if the mount is subjected to a dexterity saving throw, it takes half damage on a failure and no damage on a success. So these two last effects make the mount more durable. And in our case, since we're looking at giving the Mounted Combatant feat to a villain, that would allow any area of effect or other abilities that the mount has to stay in effect for longer. To understand how we're going to be able to utilize all of this, we need to understand how mounted combat works in D&D. So mounted combat in D&D has a few stipulations. The first is that the mount must be a willing creature. The second is that it must be at least one size larger than the rider, though it can be even larger still. And the third is that it has appropriate anatomy to serve as a mount. The appropriate anatomy is not any more specified than that, so it's up to reasonable interpretation. There are rules for mounting and unmounting. There are rules for what happens if you or the mount is knocked prone. And then there's a section on controlling the mount. So controlling the mount is just a stipulation that you have at the beginning of combat of whether or not the mount is controlled by the rider or not. And a lot of these stipulations are in there to figure out the dynamic between a player, who's a mounted combatant, and the DM. Specifically, the mount is either controlled by the rider or not. If it's controlled, then it acts alongside, or in other words, with the initiative of the rider, but it can only dash, dodge, or disengage. If it is uncontrolled, it has its own initiative turn, and that's the thing that really makes it a little bit tricky for player characters, because it's difficult for the mount to move on its own initiative and align its movement with a melee attack from the player character. You would do this if you wanted the mount to do anything other than dash, dodge, or disengage, such as attack on its own. Most of the time, a player character wants a controlled mount so that its movement and the player character's attacks are sequenced, and in order to allow the mount to dash, thus giving an enormous amount of mobility to the player character. For our purposes, since we're giving the mounted combatant feat to a villain, we actually want it to be an uncontrolled mount. In this instance, our mount gets to have whatever movement it has, bringing our villain with it, and it gets to either attack or use any other area of effect abilities that we might want it to have. And that's going to get really interesting. So without further ado, let's take a look at a couple monsters from the Monster Manual and Monsters of the Multiverse that would be particularly good candidates to be mounts for our villains. When we think of a monster that's particularly good as a mount for another creature, for another monster, the first one I think that comes to mind for most people is the Wyvern, found on page 303 of the Monster Manual. This is a challenge rating 6 flying creature, which gives incredible mobility to something that might otherwise not have a lot of mobility, not a lot of capacity to get up close to a target. The Wyvern is oftentimes used with a rider that has some sort of a ranged attack, such as spears or longbows, and the Wyvern itself has bite, claw, and stinger attacks. It's a wonderful creature to have as a mount. Specifically, the Monster Manual states that the Wyvern is oftentimes raised from hatchling to be a mount for another creature. So this is baked right into the monster. It's very appropriate and it works really well. The next monster we're going to look at is the Nightmare, found on page 235 of the Monster Manual. We're going to use this as something of a template for what we're looking for in a really good steed for our mounted combatant. The Nightmare is a large fiend, which is going to be relevant to us in a second, but his flavor text has a couple interesting things. The first is that it is a dread steed. It specifically states that creatures of exceptional evil can and do ride it. The Nightmare is created, not naturally born, when a dark ritual sacrifices a Pegasus. Now, the reason that the Nightmare is an interesting case for us to look at is that it has an intelligence of 10, modifier 0. This means that, according to the Monster Manual, creatures up to an intelligence of 10 can be trained to be willing creatures as mounts. So everything that we look at going forward is going to have an intelligence of 10 or less, and is going to be large or larger. If you have something that is a medium creature, then only small creatures could ride it, and the mountain combatant feat starts to not be very useful. I want my villain to have advantage on melee attacks against my PCs. My PCs are medium or smaller sized creatures, which means I need my mount to be large or larger. So the Nightmare is very helpful in determining what is an appropriate monster for me to choose, which is why in this video, by the way, I'm not going to be talking about riding a dragon, which is something that I think we've all kind of thought about in D&D, but it's not going to be particularly useful for our purposes in this video. The next monster we're going to look at is actually the monstrosity that is well known and loved, called the owlbear, found on page 249 of your Monster Manual. In the flavor text, it specifically states that the owlbear can be tamed, and so this challenge rating 3 monster can serve as a really interesting mount for perhaps even not evil, but just unaligned characters to ride into battle. It has a multi-attack, which means that it might operate independently as a mount in a mounted combatant situation, and it would just be a really exciting image to have in front of your players. The next monster we're going to look at that specifically states that it can be a mount is the Giant Strider, found on page 137 of Monsters of the Multiverse. This is a challenge rating 1 monster with a recharge ability. On a 5 or 6, it can spit gouts of flame, and that's something that you want to keep in play for as long as possible. So the ability from Mounted Combatant that allows you to target the rider rather than the steed will keep that recharge ability in play for a little bit longer. This is a very fun and interesting mount that you can introduce at low levels of play. Now those are 4 monsters that specifically state that they can be mounts, but there's no reason to think that other creatures couldn't be also. And what follows is a list of my favorite monsters that can serve as mounts under the right conditions and with the right villains, and have interesting abilities that make them well suited for a Mounted Combatant feat. This first one that we're going to look at is the Catoblipus, found on page 70 of Monsters of the Multiverse. The Catoblipus very likely is the deadliest challenge rating 5 monster in the entire game, and has 2 really interesting abilities. The first one is just called Stench. This is an area of effect around the Catoblipus that forces a Constitution saving throw, which a failure results in poison damage. So your rider does need to be immune to poison damage. The second ability is a recharge death ray that the Catoblipus gets to do, causing some pretty significant damage. If you have a rider that is immune to poison damage, and many monsters in the game of Dungeons and Dragons are immune to poison, then this is a wonderful mount. It discourages anybody from approaching it. Your ability to take attacks and guide them to the rider keeps the death ray in charge for longer, and can create a very scary encounter for your players. The next monster we're going to look at is the Shusuva, found on page 216 of Monsters of the Multiverse. This is a challenge rating 8 large fiend, and the flavor text gives a lot of reasons why this could be a great mount for a Mounted Combatant scenario. The Shusuva is a gift from the Demon Lord Yinagu to a particularly loyal follower, and it specifies that the Shusuva bonds with this one follower and fights alongside it in battle, and I see no reason that that could not include a Mounted Combatant scenario. It's got a poisonous tail attack, it has a multi-attack, it has rampage, and it has a 40-foot move speed with telepathy, meaning that it can take a great melee combatant and just make them more mobile and more deadly. The next monster we're going to look at is the Vrock, which is found on page 64 of your monster manual. Now this one I think is a wonderful opportunity for any campaign that has a lot of demons and fiends inside of the campaign story arc. The Vrock has a fly speed, it's a challenge rating 6 monster, and it is already a really interesting possibility for having one smaller demon ride on a Vrock, but it gets better than that. The Vrock has 2 more abilities which make it great as a mount. The first one is a spore discharge, which would poison anybody within a certain vicinity. So your rider does need to be immune to poison damage. But that's not the best part. The best part is it has a stunning scream, which has the potential of stunning any creature in a certain vicinity. But the flavor text of this specifically specifies that this does not work on demons. So if you have a demon melee combatant riding a Vrock, the Vrock can stun an opponent, and then the melee combatant has advantage on the attack against them. The last monster we're going to look at that would serve as a wonderful mount for a Mounted Combatant scenario is the Manticore, which is a challenge rating 3 monster, which you will find on page 213 of the monster manual. Now the Manticore has a multi-attack, a spiked tail, so it really serves as a vicious predator on the battlefield. It has a flying speed, so now your Mounted Combatant is flying, and the flavor text specifically states that the Manticore will work for and serve a master, so long as the master treats it well, and provides regular prey. I see no reason that the Manticore could not then also be trained to be a mount. There were a couple runners-up that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that are worth your consideration as you look for the right monster to serve as a mount in a mounted combatant scenario. The Behir on page 25 of the monster manual is a huge creature, not large, making it really interesting for this list. The Khazmi on page 57 of the monster manual would be interesting, though its intelligence is an 11, so a little bit higher than our threshold, but it would serve as a wonderful flying mount for demons. The Howler on page 155 would work provided that the rider is immune to fear. The Armanite on page 50 of the Monsters of the Multiverse book is a ruthless predator on a battlefield. And the Rock on page 260 of the Monster Manual, I think would also be a very interesting possibility of a flying mount in early-ish levels of a campaign. But once you have this monster as a mount and you have it as an uncontrolled mount, it gets to act, and you've added mobility to whatever your particular villain is that's riding it into battle. It's fun, it's interesting, and it completely changes the nature of the battlefield, which always keeps it interesting. All right, so that's what I have for you right now. I hope this has been fun and helpful and useful as you get your games up and running. As always, YouTube is literally made out of buttons. They're all over here for you to press, and I look forward to seeing you next time. All right, peace.